So welcome everyone to this QCOSS series on tender writing. This series is focused on Skilling Queenslanders for Work, or SQW or SKU, budgeting and financial management of SKU tender applications. And while we'll be using the context of the SKU initiative for this discussion, the principles we discussed today align and are relevant across many grant applications and tender applications and processes. So just a quick introduction. I'm Lisa Fraser, a Sector Development Officer with QCOSS, and I'd first like to acknowledge the Department of Trade, Employment and Training, or DETET, the government department that is funding the SKU initiative. I'd also like to acknowledge BDO Australia, who provide a range of audit, assurance and financial services, and who have generously offered their time and expertise to the development of some of the content of this presentation, and provided a lot of tips and insights into common areas where budgeting for grants can go wrong for providers. They have contributed valuable knowledge to share with you today. I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples as the First Nations owners of the lands on which I'm coming to you from today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and to their laws, customs and creation spirits. I recognise that these lands have always been places of gathering, learning, innovating and researching, leading to different ways of knowing and being. I'd like to recognise First Nations people who are present in the room today. And please feel free to join in acknowledging the country that you're joining this webinar from today. Just use the chat function. Now I can hear a bit of background noise. I'm not sure if others can, but if you can pop yourself on mute, that'd be great. Thank you. So firstly, today I'm going to provide an outline of the session, which will focus on some of the challenging areas of budgeting and financial management for grant and tender writers. By the end of the hour, I hope, or our hope, is that you'll have a better understanding of the function of budget and financial details in grant and tender applications and why these things are important, why funders and the assessment panels that look at SKU applications are so interested in what you have to say when it comes to the dollars and cents of these applications. You're going to get a whole lot of strategies for developing more accurate budgets and budget forecasts. And we're also going to look at how you can demonstrate your ability to manage these things financially by making full use of the budgeting part of the application process. So we're going to do we're going to have a quick look at financial management for grants and tenders in general before we go through the different budget items for SKU program budgets. We're going to then look at some of the common mistakes in budgeting and, importantly, how we can avoid them. And finally, we'll have a quick look at what reporting and acquittal processes look like if you do get a SKU grant, or if you are successful gaining a SKU grant. As we move through the content, you'll notice that there are some key elements that funders are looking for in your budget response. One of the elements is value for money, and it's important that this isn't confused with coming in at the lowest cost. In fact, understating your cost for the kind of project that you want to run might communicate to the assessor that you may not have a really accurate understanding of the environment that you're operating in, or what is really needed to actually run your project successfully. So funders are looking for you to have a really realistic sense of what your program is going to cost, that everything that you've costed and included is among the eligible costs under the program, and that you've got some detail in there about the partnerships and in-kind contributions that are going to add value beyond what DETET invests for your project to be successful. So we'll just move into financial management for grants and tenders. So obviously financial management is a much bigger topic, and your organisation is likely to have a whole lot of policies, procedures and processes, possibly even a whole team who have an area of responsibility around financial management in general. So we're focusing on it just in terms of grants and tenders. What does financial management look like when it comes to grants and tenders? For one thing, it looks like having a really broad and deep sense of what the likely costs and expenditures are for the type of work that you're doing. And we'll have some tips as we go along through the workshop to help you broaden the types of expenses that you consider. It means having a sense of your capacity to manage financial reporting responsibilities if you are successful receiving the grant. So this can be things like having appropriate account keeping software, having either internally or being able to contract for the kinds of guidance and checks that you might need in that sort of area, things that you have learned and capacities you've developed through managing money previously, whether that's small grants, large grants, or recurrent types of funding. So these are just examples. So good financial management also means having all of your partners and contributors on the same page when it comes to finances. So it means that anyone within your organisation who has the authorisation to make expenditures from your SKU fund knows the necessary approvals and delegations, that they know what sort of records that they need to keep, and also when things need to be provided to whoever is in charge of the reporting so that they can get all the formal paperwork done and back to the funder when that's required. So what will really help with financial management in general is if you're able to spend some time thinking about these things and doing some troubleshooting before you put your budget together. So you might learn from challenges in managing funding you might learn from the challenges of managing funding that you've already, been responsible to manage. You might look at your organisation's records for financial management in general or grant acquittals in particular and see if there are any sort of problems you can identify, such as low estimates in some areas or clear overspends and the actual acquittal in other projects. You might have a chat to teammates or people in similar organisations running similar programs about challenges they've come across and think about how you could reduce those risks in advance. And we'll talk about some of these as we're going through. So think through how you're going to manage the paperwork and the paper trail. Consider if your account keeping software allows you to quickly extract SKU expenditure, because that can get really complicated when as an organisation, you're unlikely to have SKU as your only source of income or funding. So you need to be really clear in those records that you extract that it is only SKU-related expenses you're extracting. So having software and someone able to use the software to do all of those sorts of things and thinking in advance about them can really help avoid some of those common issues. A key part of budget proposals is forecasting. Forecasting requires that you look forward into the future and anticipate potential costs relating to what's likely to happen. Forecasting inaccuracies are a major area where we see budgeting and acquittal issues. So many of these tips not only come from BDO, but they also come from DETET personnel who have assessed many SKU applications, and these are very common issues that they see in applications or budgets within applications. So apologies to some of you, it feels like we're stating the obvious in some areas. So now when it comes to budgeting, there are two key areas of forecasting, and those are inputs and outputs. Luckily for you, the SKU project, your input is fairly straightforward as it's largely the grant that you receive. You will have a few other inputs such as in-kind contributions, which we'll talk about later, but for the purposes of developing your budget and your expenditure plans, your input is just your SKU grant. So your output forecast, your forecasting for outputs is much more complex. It requires you to think about the full range of expenses that you might have and also consider how those expenses might change either before you start delivery or once you have started delivery of the project. Inaccuracies in output forecasting are a significant risk and they're common. So inaccuracies include things like wages and on costs, award increases, occurring during your project period, superannuation contributions, etc., or increases in various costs of other components of the project that haven't been factored in at the time that you're putting together the budget. So one really common area for this is the forecasting, as I said, of wages and on costs. So when we get to the actual budget items themselves, you'll see that one of the budget items is called staff wages. And this is a common item to have in a grant or a tender application, a tender budget, I should say. The challenge is if you just think about wages, you're going to seriously underestimate how much you need to expend in this area, because there are all sorts of costs associated with employing someone that aren't wages. So any of those non-wage costs of employment are what we could call on costs. And these are things like superannuation contributions, additional insurances or insurance amounts that you must have as you bring on new staff. So when you're thinking about staff wages, don't just figure out what you need to pay your workers in terms of an hourly rate for the delivery of the project, but make sure that if you're not experienced in this area of managing finances around employment, that you have a chat with somebody in the organisation who is an accountant or the financial officer or your treasurer on the board, for example, or even someone outside of your organisation with that type of expertise. So you can get these on costs and true costs accurate in your budget. The other area where things can get pretty tricky is if there are increases in costs over the time of over the project life, and that they aren't factored in upfront. So, for example, if you're thinking about putting in an application for this round of SKU, but starting delivery in say 5 months, the delivery may be over 3 months, 6 months, or a year. You're going to have a whole lot of things that occur in that period that you're costing out in your budget now, but will be subject to cost increases over the period of the grant. So if we go back to the example of wages, we might have a scheduled award increase or two in that period. We might have a staff member who is expected to go up an increment within their award band in that time. Then there might be an increase to the super guarantee, for example. So these are some of the examples of cost increases that you're going to need to use forecasting to consider in your budget. Other examples include you might have been quoted a fee, like a rental fee for a training space or the lease of a vehicle, that you're including in your budget, which may only remain relevant for a stated period and then potentially increase over the quoted amount if you start the rental or the lease agreement in 5 months' time. So as you're forecasting, you want to be considering not only what things cost now, but what they're likely to cost when you go to deliver. So we need to give some consideration to things that we can't really predict. We might be able to anticipate, but not predict with a great deal of accuracy. And it's not expected that you can do this, can predict these costs or anticipate these costs with 100% accuracy. And there are things that occur that are less likely for you to be able to anticipate. So there are also things that may or may not happen, or may not be disruptive when they do happen. So we need to think about these types of occurrences that we can't predict and how we're going to manage those if they arise. So forecasting in relation to these areas can be a particular area of weakness in budget estimates. So some examples of challenging areas to predict include things like major weather events, disrupting your program, such as disrupting training or transport or service delivery, unexpected workforce turnover. I'm not sure why we think this is unexpected, given that it occurs very frequently, but nonetheless, it has a big impact when it does occur. Illness affecting service delivery, or injuries or work cover claims when these arise. So think about, as an example, a scenario where you're running a program that has an outdoor component. Maybe you're training your participants in conservation or landscaping, or perhaps you've got an outdoor adventure-based training activity as part of your program. If the program is in Queensland and it's summer, chances are you're going to have some summer storms disrupt some of those things. So maybe there'll be localised flooding that disrupts the program at some time over that period, or think about the risks of fires, cyclones, or other potentially disruptive events that we can anticipate to a degree, and the impact they may have in terms of you delivering your program or the activities within your program. Similarly, your organisation is likely to have some kind of staff turnover in the time between applying for the grant and wrapping up a project, given that that period is quite long. So if that extends more than a few months, we know that workforce turnover is a very common issue and can have significant impacts in delivering projects. So we need to think about what happens if somebody who's involved in the rollout of the project leaves your organisation. And we always want there to be time for a thorough handover, of course. That's the ideal scenario, but often that person may leave and that's unexpected or unplanned. They may get ill, injured, or any manner of things can happen, causing a person to leave and not allow for an appropriate handover. So you may need to do some really rushed recruitment, and there are costs associated with that. So as you're doing your forecasting, think about all of those things that you know will be costs that you're going to incur. Think about whether those are likely to increase or have associated costs that you might not have thought about initially. And also think about things that may not occur, but you need to be prepared for just in case they do occur. Sometimes you can't prepare and there's not a way to manage those unexpected occurrences. That's, of course, reality. And you need to expend a lot more than you initially had forecast or budgeted for. In that case, it's really important or essential that you get in touch with the Department of Trade, Employment and Training as soon as you possibly can, or as soon as you become aware of this and identify to them that there's an issue. It might warrant you applying for a contract variation to change the relevant budgeted accounts, and you may have experienced these issues before. So if you're not in touch with DETET and getting permission for those unanticipated expenditures, you might find that your organisation is liable for covering those costs. That may be a relatively minor issue for you, depending on your organisation's financial capability. But it could be also a really serious problem if the costs are large. And in some of the SKU programs, the costs are quite large. So something to be really mindful of. So well, you're not expected to forecast with 100% accuracy, like we mentioned before. There are a lot of things that you can do to increase the accuracy of your forecasting and the likelihood of identifying potential issues. Broadly speaking, putting adequate time, effort, and inputs into the process is going to increase the robustness of your forecasting and therefore the accuracy of your proposed or estimated budget. It's critical to get the right expertise and the experience in the development of your proposed budget. This expertise may be inside your organisation, as I indicated before, including from members of your senior executive board or management governance committee, or from appropriate external stakeholders. You may consider tapping into the expertise of peers who have experience in managing similar SKU projects and related budgets and can use the knowledge that they've gained over time to help you identify potential problems that could arise. And having just been around the state delivering tender writing workshops, I can say that people were very generous with sharing some of that intel in those sessions with people fairly new to the applications for SKU. So we really encourage you to reach out to other organisations who are running a similar project. For example, if you're applying for a SKU grant and you're planning on running a Get Set for Work program, see if you can have a chat with another provider of a Get Set for Work program. You can find the list of all of the providers on the DETET website. And in the community sector, I'm not sure about people's experience out there, but often people are happy to assist and support others if they've got the time. So in addition to consulting for external input, there are things that you can do within your organisation that can help you think beyond what you originally may have considered for the budget. You can review previous project reports, especially when they include details of planned budgets and actual expenditure, and learn, I guess, from some of the gaps that might exist in those previously delivered projects. So these might help you to identify potential challenges. You can review the expenses for the programs and projects that your organisation is currently running, particularly if you're running SKU programs. You'll have learnt from those existing projects or pre-existing projects. You can look at reports provided when projects finish, and even in some cases from other organisations if they're happy to share that information with you. So you might approach an organisation who's happy to share their project reporting or find reports online that help you to know useful indicators of potential problems that could arise. So we encourage you to think about this from a risk management approach. This lens is going to not just help you think about how likely something is to occur, but also how serious the consequences would be if it did occur. For example, let's say your administration budget is really small and you don't have a lot that you need to fund in this area. What if it turns out that one of those small costs was underestimated by a few percent? As indicated before, that might not be a really big deal and your organisation can manage the issue. However, if the low estimate related to staff wages, this could incur tens of thousands in costs, or at least thousands of dollars, and it could be a very difficult expense or over expenditure to recover from. So once you figure out what's going on, what is going to have more serious consequences if these things happen, you can sort of use that to tailor the amount of time that you're going to spend on planning something and how much research you do about what likely changes and costs will occur in those sorts of things. So just to restate, forecasting inaccuracies are a common issue in SKU budgets. So we'll now turn to looking at the actual budget itself. As I mentioned earlier, this is built around the budget for Skilling Queenslanders for work programs, but you'll see similar sorts of structures and processes in all sorts of grants and tender applications. So before we go into this, the link on this slide on the right takes you to the SKU guide to applying for funding. Now, if you don't already have that, I'll strongly suggest that you do get that. Again, have been hearing from many, in fact, all DETET staff in the regions we've been delivering tender writing workshops, saying they regularly receive applications where people have not read these guidelines. The guidelines are critical. They provide really important information. They tell you exactly what you need to respond to in regard to the selection criteria, the 5 selection criteria. And they also include a page around what are eligible and ineligible SKU expenses. So there are budget tips contained in that document. So the guide's going to help you avoid some of the common problems developing budgets for tender applications. So before we go through the budget items in detail, I'll let you know that there's one thing missing from the list on the screen, or you might identify as missing if you're familiar with SKU, and those are the fees that cover the training itself or the accredited training. So in most cases, a SKU project will be in partnership with a community-based organisation will be in partnership with a registered training organisation or RTO. That the RTO will be providing the nationally recognised training, or what's sometimes called accredited training. If you're delivering nationally recognised training, you must be in partnership with an RTO or be an RTO yourself, and there will be fees for running that training that go to the RTO. And that is not included in this part of the budget, although it technically is part of the SKU budget. So those fees should be straightforward, as the RTO has to have them publicly advertised, the price for any training they're going to deliver through SKU. And the price for the SKU training must be the same as the price they would otherwise charge for that qualification in any other setting. So besides that, we have 4 major areas of cost, and then the management fee. The management fee is relatively straightforward, so we're not going to spend any time on that in detail. But the key thing to know is that it is a maximum of 5% of your total project cost of up to $115,000. So with those 2 matters out of the way, we'll talk about each of the other budget items in a level of detail. So the first item is the staff wages component. And the key thing to remember here is the fact that not just the wages, but also the on-costs, as I mentioned earlier. So how do you work out what budget amount to put in as this budget item? So the first thing to do is to break it down into different line items. So if you think about the budget item being an overall umbrella, and then you've got a whole lot of specific items underneath that, and the amounts of all of those items will total the amount for the budget item. So if the staff wages budget item is going to be made up of specific wage details for each of the roles involved in rolling out the project and then the associated costs, to work out the wages, it's a matter of figuring out how many hours each role or each person involved in the delivery is going to be performing on the SKU project, SKU specifically each week, and then simply multiplying that number of hours a week by the award level wage for that person and the weeks that they will be spending in the project. The award wage should be something that you have readily available. If it's one of the standard awards and you pay at the award level, you can search the name of the award online. If you have the award conditions for your organisation, if you have your own for your organisation, then just look into that with your finance or operations, the relevant personnel in your organisation. If you don't have people currently on staff who are going to be involved in rolling out the project, you can use the award wage that you would be advertising for those relevant positions to get an estimate of what the person's wage cost would be once they're on board. So you then need to think about what all of those on costs are going to be. So thinking about things like superannuation, additional insurances, and you'll also need to be thinking about likely increases in either wages or those on costs over the delivery period, as we talked about before. Administration costs can include expenses such as an admin office supplies. Sorry, I'll jump forward there. Consumables, but also include things like transport hire or room utilities. This is where these types of costs will sit in the budget. So you need to think about all of the things or most of these things, not just in terms of how much you are going to spend on them, but how much you are going to spend on them that is specific to SKU. So as I've already mentioned, it's unlikely that SKU is your only income source. So or the only source of funding your organisation has. And so you'll then, of course, have all sorts of other administration costs that aren't necessarily readily separated out from SKU. So regarding things like utility costs, you're not likely to be setting up an internet connection for your organisation that is specific to SKU, or setting up electricity that goes to the rooms where SKU work is happening. So therefore, you need to be figuring out what proportion of utility costs or consumables or those sorts of things are going to be dedicated to the SKU program. There are some things that are probably going to be much more obvious. For example, you can include in your budget items like the cost of a rental for a vehicle that will be used specifically for a SKU program, as long as you're only using it for SKU. In this case, it would be the full cost that you would be applying for. Things like promotions and advertising for SKU programs might be much more easily separated from other expenses if you're promoting other programs at different times. So in addition to that, the complexity of teasing out how much you're actually spending on SKU or likely to be spending on SKU, there are also quite a few excluded or ineligible items that you need to be aware of when it comes to the administration budget item. So things that you can't include in your SKU budget are things like your routine operational expenses, such as the purchase or upgrade of software, hardware, renting your own organisational premise, whether that is the use of a office space that your organisation owns or would be renting, rent at your own premises, interstate travel for training and conferences for project staff, items that should be provided by the RTO, such as stationery for training, textbooks or assessment workbooks. None of these items are eligible. As already discussed, student fees are not one of the budget items that we're discussing today because they are set by the RTO and determined in advance. The student fee should also cover things like all of the learning and assessment materials that the RTO expects of the students. So the RTO comes back to you, for example, and is seeking funding for those things or administration costs. You need to have a chat with them about what's expected of them as an RTO. And that all of those materials would be provided by them as part of the student fee. So those things are not fundable through the SKU project. So in regard to materials and equipment, this is another area that has quite a few exclusions that you need to be aware of and areas where things get a little bit complex. So this is the budget item where all of the resources you need to carry out the project and its training activities go, except for those that I just indicated around the RTO costs. So the costs here are going to vary significantly depending on the type of training that you are running. This is where having a solid understanding of your training area is important, but also the needs of your specific participants or the target cohort of people that you'll be engaging is going to be essential. So the way that the budget works in this section is going to be different between different types of projects. So as you're thinking about all of the items that you need to cost out to support the training delivery, you need to be mindful too that there are a whole lot of things you can't claim for under SKU funding. So when it comes to materials and equipment, you can't include assets or capital equipment purchases. So this means that there's no funding available for the purchase of motor vehicles, electronic equipment like computers, laptops, photocopiers, phones, tablets, and all of those kinds of things. You can't get office furniture equipment either. So none of those purchases are eligible items. So be mindful when you're nutting out what you need and be double checking whether it's an eligible cost and whether it belongs in the budget, and particularly whether it belongs under this line item. Some of you may have been to a tender writing workshop that we've delivered, or some of you may already be experienced in this area. But if you're unsure, you can also reach out to your regional DTET staff, and they're happy to discuss your budgets and whether costs are ineligible or not. As I said, there are got the guidelines for applying, the SKU guidelines for applying have information in there about inclusions and exclusions or eligible and ineligible costs. But if it's not clear to you, reach out to one of the DTET staff and they can help. They may even be able to offer ways that you or alternatives to what you're suggesting that you could include in a budget. And I've seen that happen in a number of the workshops. So the fourth budget item here is called other costs. And this is where any non-accredited training that you're providing as part of your program is costed. So remembering that any nationally recognised or accredited training that's provided by the RTO is a separate part of the budget. So under this item, you can think about things that you're providing in addition to the RTO. By way of example, in addition to the RTO, for example, running a certificate 2 in retail, you are also delivering a bespoke program of communication skill development for your participants. Then that's something you would cost through this part of the budget. Similarly, if there's training you want to provide and it doesn't happen to be on the priority skills list, this is where you would cost it. If you're not familiar with the priority skills list, it's compiled by government and includes those areas of vocational skills that, as the name suggests, are considered priorities. So there are the ones where government offers some kind of subsidy to the relevant training. If it happens that you want to deliver something that is accredited or nationally recognized or a nationally recognized training program, but it's not on the priority skills list, again, that goes in this budget item. The largest component for the budget item are the supports and other activities that you're going to provide to the participants. So we often refer to these as wraparound supports, and these are supports that make SKU a more supportive and facilitative process than most training or job preparation programs. So it's the wraparound supports that really make the difference to participants, and these are going to vary widely depending on the target group of participants that you're providing services to. So very common supports we see in SKU projects include supporting people to get driver training, to pay for licensing for cars, for vehicles, or other licenses such as white cards or security license and various other tickets that people may need to actually undertake the work that you're skilling them for. So if you'll be covering the costs or partially covering the costs of those things for your participants as part of the wraparound supports that you offer, this is where you would cost them out. So another key component of wraparound supports in most SKU programs is some kind of personal support provision. So this may include counselling, case management, family intervention, engaging with youth workers or a cultural support worker or similar. This excludes where these supports are being provided on an in-kind basis. Other costs to be included here include practical things that will help address barriers to participants engaging in training or going to work. So, for example, if you know that a lot of people in your participant group don't tend to have a good breakfast or lunch or similar, you might provide those things as part of your wraparound supports. And again, you'd be costing them here. So similarly, it can be quite common that people don't have the appropriate clothing to wear to job interviews, especially where that is expensive or they can't afford the right uniform, or there's personal protective wear for undertaking the work that they're going to be doing. So these costs are included under this item. So it's important here that we also talk about in-kind supports that may come from your organisation or others you're partnering with. If you're not familiar with in-kind supports, these are the additional resources or supports that you as an organisation or your partner organisation, or your partner organisation are going to be providing participants, but you're not going to cost them to the SKU budget. The SKU budget asks for the lead community-based organisation or their partner organisations to provide a significant proportion of in-kind supports for participants, and many community-based organisations already provide substantial in-kind supports, but don't always recognise they're doing it. So, for example, if you're running a Get Set for Work program and you know that for a whole lot of the young people who come through to the program, self-esteem will be a big issue. You might happen to have a team of youth workers in your organisation who are funded through a recurrent program of funding, as this is your core business for your organisation. Under your currently funded program, they run sessions each week for 8 weeks as a group support for building self-esteem. Now, rather than asking for funding through SKU to run that group, you're going to be covering that through your usual program of service delivery, as an example. So In some proposed budgets in grants and tender applications, you're actually not expected to cost out the value of in-kind supports. However, in the SKU budget, DETET actually do want community-based organisations to cost out that support and be clear about and provide a ballpark figure, I guess, or cost associated with providing that support. And that includes partner organisations as well. So you'll get your cost estimate in exactly the same way that you would do for any other estimates. That is, you cost out staff wages, hours and hours dedicated to the task of the in-kind contribution, using the award wage of each person involved and the number of weeks that's being provided. Similarly, say there's a community centre down the road and they have a minibus that they don't use on Tuesdays, and they're happy for you to use the bus for your SKU program. This can be included as an in-kind contribution. So if you do Tuesday activities, you've got a bus there ready to take your participants out for an adventure, learning or industry visits, or whatever your training or additional activities are. The value of that donation is simply what the community organisation would ordinarily charge if they were renting the bus out. So if you're providing some transport and that your organisation is funding, estimate the costs of the fuel and maintenance associated with that transport use and include that as an in-kind contribution. In-kind costs are to be included in your budget. However, you need to remember not to include them when you're totaling your budget ask in your application, so they don't form part of your overall budget ask. If you've got any queries about this, you can also contact your DETET office, regional DETET office, and they are happy to talk this through. They will be happy to talk it through. So we will move on now to some common mistakes that are made in SKU applications and tenders and grants broadly. So we've already touched on ensuring you're knowledgeable regarding eligible and ineligible costs for the SKU budget. So it's an important area as it goes to how reliable the assessor thinks you are as a potential recipient of funding. So if you've included ineligible costs in your budget, it could be indicative to the funder that you haven't done your due diligence regarding developing your understanding of the specific grant requirements. So that's not the kind of impression that you're wanting to give a SKU assessor. Instead, you want to be double and triple checking that everything you've included is an eligible inclusion. So again, go to the SKU guide to applying for funding, as this includes eligible and ineligible costs very clearly. So SKU funds are only able to be expended on eligible activities until the delivery end date, despite the final report not being due for another 90 days. Support offered to participants in that period must be in-kind support. So make sure to include staffing costs beyond current wages, as we've already touched on, superannuation and award increases, and include these details in the budget. Work cover costs, check insurance policy to ensure budgeting and the right amount for each trainee. DETET has identified some confusion from a number of SKU providers regarding funding for post-participation support, so it's worth being clear about that. Another budget mistake is having budget items that are too vague. So this might happen because you've got an overall valuation for the budget item without breaking that down into more detailed line items. So this is a simple fix, as it can take, but it can take more time, of course. So be clear about all of those things that you're going to be spending that money on, and having each different type of expense broken up into its own line within that overall budget item. So, for example, rather than saying I'm going to be spending 20,000 on administration, you need to break that down. Regarding consumables, perhaps you expect this to be about $1,700, a few hundred for printing, some rent for external premises that you need to undertake the training in, or a specific type of activity. And you can keep itemizing the different items that make up that 20K budget for administration. So more detail is better to enable the assessors to determine whether your budget asks are reasonable. They will be comparing what you're asking for with benchmark costs or fairly standard costs. And it's worth noting that the assessors have a really good understanding of the expected costs of things. So they certainly will pay attention to this area. Provide quote estimates or workings wherever you can. You can attach quotes to your application and to your budget. For example, you might say you have a quote for $10,500 in rent for a training room that another organisation owns and you want to use each week. I would simply have the quoted amount in the budget, but in the notes section of the line where you've written the rent, you would specify exactly what that rent cost was for. So that is the rent of a training room for X number of hours and see attached quote. So you're wanting that level of specificity in your budget. So include the name of that document. So if the assessor wants to double check the amount or get any other details about that line item in your budget, they know there's an attached document and everything's there for them to go and see. A related problem that comes up apparently in every DTET round is that someone will submit a budget that includes line items that aren't mentioned or very clearly connected to any of the delivery activities that they've mentioned in the other assessment criteria responses. So, for example, you might be intending to provide lunch each day to the participants in the training as part of your wraparound supports, but this isn't stated somewhere and you include it as a line item for lunches in the budget. So the assessor will not be clear on why you're asking for food money if you haven't clearly stated this as one of your assistance strategies for participants. So similarly, if you have indicated in your participant assistance strategies that you're going to be providing lunches, you need to ensure you've got a line item in your budget relating to this item. Otherwise, it indicates your organisation is planning to provide this assistance strategy and it won't be costed to the SKU program. So that could come back on you. So being very clear and detailed with your budget items helps both the assessor understand what you're asking for, and it also helps you as an organisation. If you're successful with your tender application, it's going to assist you with budget tracking throughout your program and when it comes to complete acquittals. You can log your expenditure and see areas that appear to be tracking well and where there may be problems. And if you do notice problems, like we mentioned earlier, if some things end up a lot more expensive than you expected, you could be liaising with DTET quickly around a variation of contract. So the other thing is there is the possibility that the person responsible, of course, for leading the project and managing the budget is going to leave your organisation partway through. Or may have an absence of work in the project period. So if you have a very detailed budget, then the person who picks this up and is responsible for it, it's going to give them a really clear idea on what they need to do to manage the program appropriately. Whereas if you have a vague budget items, that sort of clarity just isn't there for people. And the final common issue that people fall into, or people that DTET identify, is the budget just actually doesn't add up. And just to emphasize, I guess, that these are common problems. So again, sounds like it's probably stating the obvious, but that's not the case. They receive many budgets that don't add up. Sometimes there are many thousands of dollars out. So you'll want to have at least two different ways that you're going to be checking your budget line items and that they do add up. And we recommend not only adding it up a few different ways yourself, but then getting someone else to do an assessment and see if they come to the same amount. And of course, if they don't, you'll see there's something amiss. Another option is to use built-in calculation processes, for example, using Excel spreadsheets or budgeting accountancy software, where you can often use formulas or features of the tools to calculate totals. As I talked about earlier, for each budget item, noting a subtotal made up of all of the line items within it can be helpful. I then add up all of those budget item subtotals and make sure that the total is the same as the total of all of the line items. Again, if those don't add up, which quite often they don't because we make some kind of mistake in calculation, you know something's amiss, it will alert you to that and you'll be able to correct it. So importantly, getting a second set of eyes on your budget is important, and making sure that is somebody with experience. Well, now we'll have a quick look at the acquittal before we finish in a few minutes. So acquittal is basically just detailing what you've spent in a way that it can be very easily compared against your budgeted amounts. In the case of SKU programs, DETET makes this pretty easy for you, as they provide a bespoke acquittal template, which I'll show you on the next slide, as part of the service agreement once the funding has been approved. DETET input your budget item amounts into the acquittal agreement for you, and you can clearly see which sort of items you have which amounts associated with them. So you can use that as a gauge as you start expending those funds to make sure that you're not going over in any of those areas or highlight where there is a real challenge. So there is more than one way to acquit for your SKU project. Most often SKU funding will be split. So you might be putting in one interim acquittal in the middle of your delivery. So after you've received one amount of funding, and you do an acquittal showing how you've spent that. And you must put in the acquittal before you get the next amount of funding, for example. But all SKU projects, regardless of their length, will have a final acquittal to be submitted with your final reports. So this is just a shot of what the acquittal template looks like that they provide you. The one you receive will obviously contain all of your budget inputs. But as you go about expending your funding for SKU, it's important that you're noting each area of expenditure as well, so that you can record it against the relevant budget item. So you need to be careful. For example, if you make some administrative purchases or you pay some bills, but you're not noting it in your accountancy software, that those are associated with the administration budget item. That can, of course, get tricky when it comes to putting the acquittal together. So as you're trying to figure out, or you're leaving people trying to figure out which budget item and the different receipts relate to. So, we recommend you do yourself or your finance folks a great favour and make sure your account keeping software helps you to enter the detail when you are recording information about the expenses. So this is going to make it much simpler to pull out all of the relevant expenses when you go to put the acquittal together. So the intention is the approved budget and the actual expenditure are the same. It's not expected that they're going to be dollar perfect, as we talked about earlier, as it's highly unlikely to develop a perfectly accurate forecasted budget. But we do want actual expenditure to be largely in line with the approved budget amounts. So be mindful that if you really have overspent in one area, you may not be reimbursed by DTET, even if you've underspent in another area. So you can't just take money from from an area of underspend and put that into an area of overspend. This is not the way it works with grant funding. So as discussed earlier, if an issue of overspend arises or the potential to overspend arises, you need to contact a TET as quickly as possible, and then they'll work with you on a potential grant variation if that's appropriate. So moving on just quickly to acquittal declarations, your CEO or the equivalent with the appropriate authority in the organisation must sign an acquittal declaration. In many cases, there will need to be additional steps as well. So for a SKU grant between 100,000 and 500,000, it's both the CEO or equivalent who must sign and the organisation's accountant. For grants that are over 500,000, and any project that involves a work skills traineeship, there needs to be a full audit report. A full audit report is an audited financial statement with an accompanying full transaction list. If your organisation regularly gets grant funding for projects acquitted in this way, you can sometimes bundle them and send them to your accountant for acquittal. Or you might do that at the same time that you're sending off all of your financials to an auditor before your AGM or annual general meeting. But either way, you must get the full report done for grants over 500,000 or involving any amount of funding for the work skills traineeships. So we're a minute over time, but this pretty much brings us to the end of the presentation today. So just to recap on a few of those key points, the SKU budget is made up of a series of different budget items, and these are lots of ways that things can get tricky with those budget items. But if you put in a little bit more time and effort, you can avoid a lot of the common mistakes that are made in these applications. Importantly, provide detailed notes, quotes, costings and workings wherever you possibly can to help the assessor see exactly what it is you intend to spend the grant on. Make sure that you are double and triple checking that you're only putting those eligible costs in and that your costs all add up properly, and keep your costs in a reasonable, cost-effective range. So not aiming for the lowest possible cost and understating your true costs. I just wanted to say, I hope you've found the information shared today helpful. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out to us, or if it's a technical question about SKU, I recommend that you contact your regional DTET personnel. And I'd like to thank you for coming today and joining and staying and participating in this session.